To today's meeting of the Planning Committee. The main item today is a discussion with invited guests on permitted development rights, and thank you for those guests taking the time to come and see us today. We very much appreciate you being here. Members of the public can follow the meeting on the webcast and on Twitter using hashtag Assembly Planning and hashtag Permitted Development Rights. Please may I remind members, guests and audience to turn off their phones. That reminds me, that's rather good. And keep them on silent, or keep them on silent. Can I ask if there have been any apologies received for today's meeting?
Apologies about absence have been received from Assembly Member Shah.
Thank you. Can I ask, we'll go now on to item 2, with the declarations of interest. Can I ask members to note the list of offices on the report and ask if they have any additional interest to declare? Thank you. On item 3, the minutes. Can we agree the minutes from our previous meeting held on the 11th of July 2019? Agreed. Thank you. On the summary list of actions, item 4, can I ask members to note the ongoing actions arising from previous meetings?
Noted.
Thank you. We now come on to item 5, which is the Planning Code of Conduct. And for those of guests who are waiting for the later item, this won't take too long. We have with us Emma Strain, the Monitoring Officer, and Julie Emma McLaughlin to come and present this item to us, if you may.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for having me today, and to Julie Emma for coming along also. As the paper sets out, we have a planning code of conduct for elected members, and as part of the appendix to that sits a planning code of conduct. That planning code of conduct was written in 2012 and is comprised of 3 parts: one for elected members and co-opted members of the authority, a part for staff exercising mayoral delegated authority, and a planning protocol for staff. Having looked at these documents as part of the Chief Officer's review of Register of Interest and Gifts and Hospitality, we felt that it would be a good time to update the document. So we've taken the 3 separate documents and formed them into one single document which will apply to all of the people I mentioned earlier. We have removed outdated references to pre-2012 standard regimes, attempted to make the document more concise and orderly from a logic perspective, and made some other small changes. I'd just like to note that the planning functions, decisions and actions exercised by the Mayor and the Assembly in scrutinising them should be exercised properly and lawfully, and this document does nothing to prevent that. It also sets out that nothing in this code is intended to restrict the legitimate and appropriate scrutiny of the exercise of the Mayor's planning functions by GLA staff and others on their behalf by the Assembly, its committees and Assembly members.
Thank you very much.
Following this meeting, any discussion, any points that you'd like to make on this, the intention was I write to all Assembly members to let them know about the intentions of this document, and then it would proceed to a full plenary of the Assembly at the end of October, but subject to your comments.
Thank you very much. Are there any comments on this? I do have one comment. I myself found it difficult to understand whether or not Assembly members who haven't got a decision-making power would be affected by this code of conduct, and whether or not in any future situation it might prevent us from commenting or having a meeting on, for example, any current planning application. And of course, we don't make decisions unless you're the Deputy Mayor, who has the potential to make planning decisions in the absence of the Mayor. We as Assembly members have no decision-making powers with regard to planning applications. I therefore found some of the language a bit confusing as to whether or not what we need to stick to that isn't already covered in our existing code of conduct. There seem to be obligations on us, which I'm not entirely sure I agree with.
Yeah. I mean, the intention, and I will go back through and check to make sure that we haven't accidentally, by omission or by not being clear to who it applies, made that happen. But the intention is that it does not restrict the opportunity for Assembly members to scrutinise, to comment, and that you can do so within the realms of that code of conduct that sets out the NOLA principles. So within that structure, it should not make any difference or stop you doing anything.
Well, thank you very much for that. I really do appreciate that. Perhaps an explicit line in there, echoing exactly what you've just said, may very well help us in future.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
I've just got one.
Yes.
As a planning chairman in Westminster, I just want to make sure there's no conflict or anything in terms of what you've written in here, which again I agree with Andrew. It's it could be interpreted in many ways really, and the role of a borough council in London.
Okay. I'll take that one away as well.
With that, any other Assembly members? That being said, thank you very much for your attendance. Very much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, if we can give us a slide. I beg your pardon. Oh, I beg your pardon. Can I ask members to note the new draft planning code of conduct?
Noted.
Noted. That needs to be said. I do apologise. Rather than goodbye. Yes, that's it.
Oh, noted with your caveat.
Yeah, with the caveat, yes.
And that'll be minuted, will it?
Will that be minuted? The caveats about...
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So this brings us to today's main item on permitted development rights. If we just hold fire for a few seconds while our guests come and assume their seats. Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome our guests, and I'll list you out for those people who are watching on the webcast. We have from my left to right Arshad Bhatti, who's the Chief Executive of Apex Airspace, Julia Park, who is the Head of Housing Research at Levitt Bernstein. We have got Paul Lewin, Planning Policy Team Leader from Brent Council. We've got Dr. Jessica Ferm, who's from the Bartlett School of Planning, University College London. We have Jack Airey, who's the Head of Housing from the Policy Exchange. And we have Henry Smith, who's the Projects and Policy Manager at the Town and Country Planning Association. I understand you have to leave about 4 p.m. and we've got that. So, if we can move on to the first question. We're talking about the impact that permitted development rights have had on London. But let's go back to the start of them. Perhaps we can ask somebody to summarise for us what are permitted development rights and why were they introduced. I know I wouldn't be particularly welcome Jack Airey's view on why they were introduced, but who's got a succinct explanation as to what they are?
Try.
Thank you.
So many things need planning permission and some things don't. So something called the General Permitted Development Order 2015 sets out what needs planning permission and what is permitted development. And over time, government has increased the amount of things that have become permitted development, either because planning authorities may be inundated with small applications for things that really don't need planning permission, so they're taken out of the general permitted development, they're created as permitted development. But I suppose some of the loosening up is to do with the rhetoric of planning and it's sort of stopping things happening as well. So at the moment, or certainly over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a lot of emphasis on looking at permitted development rights to usurp some of the sort of current planning practices and need for planning permission. So the biggest one that's probably had the biggest impact is the office to residential, which it's not an automatic that you get planning permission for that. You have to meet a couple or two or three conditions to be signed off by the local authority through a prior approval process. And the more recent processes for permitted development have successively sort of introduced more and more conditions associated with the sign-off of permitted development, almost as if they're planning permissions in a way, but the principle has already been agreed, so all you're doing is signing the conditions off. Looking forward, government has indicated that it still wants to introduce further permitted development rights. So one of the things that is specifically mentioned is the ability for you to be able to knock down existing office developments and replace them with residential developments, and that will be through permitted development rights. So it's not clear how that would work because government's mentioned it a couple of times and asked for views but hasn't actually set out how it would work. And another one, it's quite complicated, which is probably why it hasn't worked, it's not been introduced so far. And another one which definitely is they're thinking of is upward permitted development rights as well. So providing new residential in roof space or going above that to, again, it's not been decided how high it could go, but the talk is, you know, if it was in a parade of buildings, you would go to essentially to the highest one within the parade, or the average height, or, you know, it might be, I mean, the discussion document talked about many things, but one of, you know, it might be across a wider area, etc. So there are things that government's looking at to simplify the planning process, I suppose, to make developers more certain that they can develop their sites. And I guess
We've got a number of questions
to make that
later
quicker.
about the
Sure.
details of the new proposals from the government. Mr. Airey, why were they, and I know Policy Exchange and yourself were involved very early as a great advocate for bringing in this policy, which came in 2013, I understand. Why were the permitted development rights introduced, as far as you're concerned? What were your Policy Exchange's motives for getting involved?
So we produced a paper in 2011 by my predecessor, predecessor of 3, I think, and someone else called Richard Ehrman, and making the case for freeing up this policy, mainly with the idea of bringing certainty and clarity into the planning system. I think, as Paul said, there is a general view that the planning system can be slow, it's complex, and unnecessarily so is the key part of that. Recently, a judge described planning policy as a statutory thicket. So I think that's kind of the background to this. And then there's also, we looked at, I'm speaking on behalf of the authors. I was still at university at the time this paper was produced, so in a way I'm speaking on behalf of them, but I think the producer is seeing that there are quite a lot of redundant office buildings scattered across the UK, or England rather, that were not, that they felt planning departments were not dealing with quick enough any applications for their kind of renovation. And so the idea was to, if you brought in a permitted development for office to residential, and I think they made recommendations on other permitted development too, that would bring forward a large number of new homes. I don't know if they approximated how many would come, but I think they were surprised by the numbers that eventually came. I think each year there have been about 17,000 new homes in London, around 6,000 or 7,000, at least in 1 year. And that's quite a lot. That's quite a significant amount, especially in London. And so I have a feeling I'm going to be on my own here defending the policy. So I think, but I think it's important. the current mayor and the past mayor, I think secretly and privately will probably quite like the policy because it brings forward quite a large number of new homes, and there are issues with it. I'm sure we'll discuss it today, but there are certainly ones that need to be addressed, and I look forward to discussing that further.
The current mayor as well.
That is my assumption.
Yeah.
I mean, publicly,
But
publicly it makes sense politically for Assembly members and the mayor to oppose this. It's a Labour Party policy to oppose this. They say it allows slum housing, and there are certainly a few egregious examples of what have gone through this policy or through this route through the planning system. However, I make the case today that it's a loophole that can easily be closed. Policy Exchange made there was government did a consultation on this. I think it was late last year or start of this year on high street reform or high street reform through planning reform or something like that. And in our response to that, we were recommending to the government how you might close this loophole, which allows some substandard homes.
of course.
I just want to say that 28 boroughs objected to this when it first came in, and in fact. And the mayor definitely objected, the then mayor definitely objected to it in central London. And the current mayor has objected to all the extensions of PD rights, just so we are clear.
Chair, I just wanted to perhaps read a quote to you from the Secretary of State at the time, Eric Pickles, in 2013. He said, it's about office to residential permitted development, he said, the changes would encourage developers to bring underused offices back into effective use as houses for local residents. They will provide badly needed homes. They will also create jobs in the construction service industries and help regenerate our town centres. So I think we could start with sort of unpicking every one of those. Say, are they providing homes for local residents? Are they achieving those economic development goals and regenerating our town centres? It was a good starting point because that was the intention of the policy.
Well, perhaps, thank you for that. Mr. Bhatti, what are the benefits to developers of using the PDR scheme over full planning approval? Because it's not as though you can't develop a block, an industrial building. You just have to go through the planning approval process. So what are the advantages to developers or the benefits to developers?
Thank you, Chair. I think the main thing, obviously we are not office to resi developers. We also see it as a learning process that if we are campaigning for any kind of planning freedoms with regards to airspace development or rooftop development, then we'll be careful of making sure that loopholes or the unintended consequences that came through office to resi, they be looked at. Having said that, and I would outline the proposals or where we see the problems are, I think what PDR provides in principle is speed and assurance that if you meet certain criteria within a time frame, you will achieve planning permission and you can base your decisions on that. And I think that is an outcome which in itself is not a bad outcome because it would result in homes built and we do need homes. However, how do we get there and how do we make sure that unintended consequences do not happen? I think that's something the committee will look into it, and I would be happy to kind of give our opinion. But I think getting to a point that there is speed and assurance is a good thing.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Assembly Member Gavron, perhaps you'd like to ask a few questions.
There's it was late last year, wasn't it? Someone will have to put me right on this. That the government came in with the consultation about extending permitted developments to the upward extensions by 2 stories. And I also want to go on to ask about the other part of that, which is about demolition. But what impact does that have? Would people like to talk about the impact they think that will have? Just let's take the 2-story permitted development extensions. Who would like to have a go at that?
Yes, Ms. Park.
I think, certainly in terms of visual impact, it could be enormous. I can't think of many buildings that wouldn't look substantially different with a 1 or 2 story upward extension. particularly in cases where access to those new floors isn't particularly straightforward. I mean, if you're using an existing entrance and you're able to extend the existing stairs and lift shaft, which is quite a feat in itself, then at least the effect is limited to the extension itself. But in many cases, I think we'll also be talking about new forms of access being necessary, and potentially at the front of buildings, for example, where there's no rear access. So I think potential visual impact is huge, and whether developers try to aim to replicate the style of the building below and simply extrude it in similar materials, or whether they feel it's better to have the rooftop extension handled in a different way, there are practical and aesthetic challenges which should not be underestimated, not least making sure the roof can carry the weight and so on. So I'm not against the idea in principle of extending buildings, just as I'm not against the idea of turning offices into residential use in principle. It can work, but it's often difficult, delicate, controversial stuff. And my view is that permitted development rights should only apply to very low impact interventions, which are not very visible, not very complicated, not very likely to affect neighbours, not very likely to upset the balance of uses in an area. And to me, that's, I mean, I'm sure we'll come onto this, but that's, many of those things that the planning system does quite effectively and for good reason.
That's very helpful, thank you. Can I just, for clarification, the government, through the planning system, you can also go 2 stories upwards, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so we're talking about now permitted development. The consultation came out, this mayor objected, we objected, but it's now fiat, it's gone through, hasn't it? But just remind us.
I don't think it's gone through yet.
It hasn't gone through.
No?
I think they said they were minded to do it, but it hasn't actually happened yet.
It's coming up. They're looking at the detail of it, is that right?
Yes, that's my understanding.
So minded to do it means that they're not, and they're on the way, they just want more detail?
Well, I think I did read somewhere that they among other things, they are considering the potential issues around getting access to these stories. Because they're supposed to provide additional homes, not just make existing homes bigger. This is all about new homes. So you need a way up to your new home.
Of course. Can I just check something? When the consultation, was it only about, it wasn't just about high streets?
No.
2-story extensions?
No.
It's about all buildings.
It was a ramshackle sort of elements of planning related discussion popped into a document sort of with the title High Streets, but it covered a much wider variety of planning matters than just high streets.
Because I think some people think it's going to be high streets, but in fact it's all buildings? Can go up by
Well, there would be, this is the part of the consultation, so conservation areas probably would sit outside it, but other areas might well. I think it is, as I mentioned, it is complicated, and this isn't the first time that they've consulted on it. So I think each time they're sort of going further down a route of understanding the implications, and then sort of the next time they consult, they've got a bit more flesh on the bones, really, of how it might work.
And Apex wants to come in.
Yeah, can we...
Sure. Some of the points that Julia picked up. We are actually doing airspace development. We came up with the idea of making a business out of it. We came up with the idea that how we can scale it up, how it can be done. It does happen at the moment, and it's very scattered, and there are a number of challenges. 2 things I do want to highlight straight away. What happens with any airspace development, any extension to any building, When you do that, you have to make sure that the whole building, the building below and the new one, whole building complies with the current building regulations. It makes the building secure. That's the first part. It has to happen. I mean, even if there's permitted development, we'll still have to comply with building regs. That's one. Two is that in current planning regime, we are going through planning number of schemes currently. We have to also prove to planners that we are actually enhancing the building. So it's not just we are just maintaining the building. It actually is enhancing the outlook of the building. I think these two things inherently are good things in terms of there is a way that you're enabling the buildings to be securer. If there is fire safety issues, it's not. If there are, for example, fire safety issues. So if we are to deliver 4 units above a block of 26 units, where we have to change doors of all the 26 to make them fire compliant. So these are the two key elements to start with. I'll go into, and none of the schemes have. I mean, we have a number of schemes live and a number of schemes appraised. None of the schemes has external stairs. None of them. All of them, because we have to comply with the policy, current policy. I think later on I will come to the challenges of how current planning policy actually is not optimum use in terms of what airspace development can do. These two things, Julie also highlighted the fact about the structural stability of buildings. Now these things do get looked at through the process currently. And there are two ways that you do airspace development. First point of call is to make sure there is a structural survey, to make sure the building is capable of taking extra load, and it results into one of the two situations. Either it can, if it's a 1-story extension or 2-story extension, or it cannot. And if it cannot, then the way around is that you build an exoskeleton frame around the building, whereby you put the new foundations on top of the roof, and then this building does not take any further weight than it currently has.
At the end of Nikki's question,
Henry Smith, you'd like to come in.
Just 2 points from the TCPA on the question about the potential implications of the further extensions to permissive development rights. The first point is about the impacts on placemaking. This has been a major fiscal giveaway, as the work of UCL with RICS has previously shown. A major giveaway to the private sector due to the loss of contributions that you get through the planning system. And what we've heard from developers who are obtaining full planning permission through the regular routes is that they don't feel this is a level playing field. The fact that their neighbour with an office block can convert a building without the need to contribute towards the vitality of town centres and contributions to hospitals, schools, etc. So there's that first point about placemaking, and then second one, I think, which comes back again to the initial sort of intention of this policy, is that we don't believe this will add any certainty to the situation. Actually, it will cause a lot more confusion. The types of caveats that are being suggested for these additional stories include the creation of design codes, consideration to neighbours. I mean, we're effectively returning back to the planning system. And what I think we risk doing is creating a confusing and contradictory zoning system, which undermines a lot of the detailed work that boroughs are doing on creating their local plans, and undermines community participation and legitimacy of decisions on the built environment.
I mean, will it take? I mean, is it proposed? Perhaps this is a detail that it'll also happen in conservation areas.
It is excluded.
That's
Conservation areas are
excluded.
excluded. They are excluded. Conservation areas are excluded.
Can I? Does anyone else want to comment on what's been said?
Yeah, I would just say one thing.
I thought somebody different, maybe. Well, okay, go ahead.
Just to, kind of counterbalance the point that what it could lead into by giving away some of the planning powers. On the other end of the spectrum, I would like to highlight a scheme which is of 30 affordable units, 100% affordable, at affordable rent level in Zone 2, bordering Zone 1, and it complies with design standards, it complies with the rest of all the policies. It is still in planning after 12 months. So that's the other end. So there is a way that you can actually, I think this will be one of the very few schemes which is actually 100% affordable rent scheme. Very, very few. It's a commodity. I'm pretty sure it kind of doesn't exist. no developer would come around and say, I will deliver 100% affordable rents, because it just doesn't make sense. Airspace can make it happen. You are still in planning after 12 months. I'll be happy to share the details.
Yeah, and I'm going to leave Tom to talk to you about that. But is there anyone else who wants to comment on what they've heard?
Mr. Airey.
On a point around the loss of affordable housing contributions, in some ways it's actually a circular argument, because a lot of the housing that's being provided through this route is kind of at the lower end of the market. So the homes that are being produced have been kind of they cost less. So yes, like with affordable housing contributions, you provide homes, inexpensive homes for some people. Whereas with a shift towards liberalising the system in a small way, you're actually you're finding ways to provide inexpensive housing to everyone. So I just make the point, it's like it's a slightly circular argument to complain about lack of affordable housing. Secondly, actually when Policy Exchange proposed this in 2011, what we suggested was, in terms of developer contributions, was that a flat rate charge per converted housing unit would apply as at the same level as the new homes bonus. So in fact, the kind of what we proposed wasn't actually taken forward by the government. They actually took the idea kind of more radically than we even suggested, in terms of not having any sort of developer contributions.
Mr. Smith.
Could I just quickly come back on the point about how this is creating affordable housing? I think probably the most worrying elements of statistics that we've gathered so far is that the vast majority of these, based on UCL's research again, are studio flats and one-bedroom flats, but actually because of the total lack of any type of monitoring or compliance of the homes that are being created, you're seeing overcrowding within these units. So instances where a prior approval can state that the units should be studio or one-bedrooms, and actually what's being built are two-bedrooms, three-bedroom homes. So there's a real impact on actually who's living there and the families that are living there, which under normal circumstances, under usual affordable housing contributions, they'd be managed by a registered provider, housing association, and there'll be control over that process for really vulnerable people sometimes.
We're going to ask a few questions about the quality of the developments in a little time.
Julia, do you want to come back in?
I was going to say a similar thing actually, so I'm happy to wait. Thank you.
Is there another question on affordable housing later, or if there's anything else?
We'll probably.
Are we going to?
Affordable? No, go ahead.
No. Okay, thanks. I mean, the point that Jack made there about the sort of market-led affordability of this housing coming forward is you know, I've heard that argument quite a lot. This really comes down to an issue of morality, I think, and what, you know, the kind of housing that we want to develop for people. And the bottom line is that it is, you know, some of those units are affordable, but it's because they are tiny and they are really, really poor quality. So, I mean, our figures at a sort of national scale are that 30% of the units delivered under PD meet national space standards compared to 94% under planning permission. And that's a huge gap. I don't have those exact figures for London in front of me. I might be able to get those. And they don't have access to private amenity space. There are, you know, figures on that as well. You know, the issue of affordable housing is not just about market provision of slightly cheaper housing because it's of poor quality. We are, you know, missing out on delivering the numbers of social housing units and other units under that affordable housing category. And again, we've got figures on those for specifically for some of the London boroughs, which we can provide to you.
We would welcome that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry,
I think it's unlikely to be. Well, it would be. Yeah, it's very difficult environment for families. These extensions, families with children, I'm talking about, and where would you get the recreation space and so on? And then it would rule out presumably people with disabilities and so on, mobility issues. I don't know if any of that's been thought through. Tom, I wondered, did you want to come in on this?
There's a couple of things. Well, firstly, on the affordability, because I'm going to unashamedly plug the report I did on this, which is called Slums of the Future. And I actually object to the use of the word home to describe a lot of these. They're boxes for people to exist in. And I've got an example here, Lambeth, of a block in Lambeth that was converted. 27.5 square metres, which I think 5 metres below the space standard for a 10 metres below the space standard for a one-person flat. It's a studio. £1,343 per month. Now the average for Lambeth is for a studio is about £850 to £950 according to the London rents map. So we're talking, significantly more for something which is, quite clearly a sort of inferior product. So I mean, I don't know if Jack wants to come back on this idea that is £1,343 for 27.5 square metres really affordable? And affordable to who?
I mean, every home is affordable to someone. I suppose is the response to that. I'm not trying to be trite about it, but you can I object to the term morality. I mean, it's the suggestion that what I'm saying is immoral. What I would say is immoral is, I think the way to make homes more inexpensive is to build more of them, to increase supply where people want to live. I think the best way of doing that is relaxing planning controls in places where people want to live, putting more land in for development. The reason we can't do that is there are planning controls. The reason I spend so much money on my rent, huge amounts of my income on it, is because we have these planning controls that prevent us building where people want to live around London. I think that is immoral. So, you can cut it both ways. And when you set a block for people to exist in, that's kind of like saying what Le Corbusier said about a home being, I can't remember the quote now, but, I live in a studio flat and it's just one room and it's, 15 square metres or something, and I pay far too much. So,
the question is whether this is a solution to the housing crisis or a symptom of the housing crisis, and I would say it was more likely to be a symptom. Julia
yes,
wants
sorry,
to comment on this.
yeah. A couple of things. There's a huge number of permissions in place that haven't been implemented in London and across the country, and if they were, we would not have a housing crisis. So that big cohort of stuff that does have planning permission but hasn't been built for one reason or another, the blame for that does not lie at the planning door because they have permission. That's one thing. It is true that permitted development is, and for all the wrong reasons, actually providing social housing in effect, because we're not getting enough social housing through the proper routes. So in the sense, what I mean by that is that, and it tends to be, my research shows overwhelmingly it's the worst, smallest, poorest quality developments that are typically being left to people on housing benefit, often very vulnerable people, and people who come with often very tragic stories and need support that they, apart from housing, they need other forms of support which social landlords would normally provide, but of course in these developments that isn't available. And there's some, and it's a minority, and I completely accept that there are brilliant developers out there, for whether it's for upward extensions or office conversions or buildings in general. So we are talking about the less good developers, I think, generally this afternoon. But there are developers who deliberately target their homes, offer these homes in converted office buildings to local authorities for people on their housing waiting list, and it works because they are the smallest, worst homes in the neighbourhood, and that makes them the cheapest. So, and for the landlord, they can potentially fill up these blocks in a day without having to advertise them even, and make as much money for less trouble certainly on the higher rate of housing benefit. So there are some who are so canny they target over 35s, for example, so that you get the higher rate of local housing allowance.
Because we're going to come on, and also this question of whether or not they increased supply or if they decreased by significantly versus what the situation would be if they'd just gone through planning later on. But I just wanted to cover another issue as well, and maybe ask Henry for his view on this. Because there's also an impact, whether it's upward extension or demolition or rebuild or conversion of office to resi, that a lot of these could have been done anyway, but would have had to have been done broadly in line with a local plan, with a London plan, possibly with a neighbourhood plan. And what's the impact, you think, of this on people's confidence in the planning system? Because I know, from being a councillor as well, you get people coming to you say, we need to stop this from happening. And you say, well, sorry, there's nothing the council can do about it. And I think that makes people, or for a lot of people, think, well, what on earth are you there for then if you can't do anything about it? But I think it also, there's a lot of lack of faith in the planning system anyway. Do you think this increases the sort of lack of faith in the planning system and in local democracy?
I think that we believe there's a really sort of severe issue here with a lack of legitimacy around these decisions that are being made, because many of the schemes that we've seen don't include floor plans, for instance, within the prior approval process. Many of them contain very vague information about what's being proposed, and I'll sort of come along to an example just outside of London in Watford, where recently a planning inspector approved a scheme that half of the units don't include windows on, and admitted that living without a window would not be a positive living environment, but that under the conditions of the GPDO, he simply wasn't allowed or able to refuse it. Even further, there wasn't any information about an escape route. So there's fundamental safety issues here, the planning system is based on a democratically controlled and a system which is based on confidence of the public, and this is severely undermining it.
Would anyone else like to comment on this point about local democracy?
Who might want to comment?
Oh yes, of
Just
course.
before Mr. Lewin does comment, Mr. Smith, you're talking about the standards that may not be complied with, but some of these are building control standards, aren't they, that would need to be complied with, irrespective of whether or not they're permitted development rights.
So what we've seen are examples that, because of this, what is a fundamental undermining of the standards and regulations that local planning authorities would expect through usual planning permissions, is that their resources for enforcement, their resources under building regulations are undermined. And so, an example in Croydon, where one of the stairwells was removed through the conversion of the building for a 118 unit scheme, leaving only one stairwell left for the building. So I think although the argument is that building regulations do apply, what we're seeing is that in practice they're not being implemented, they're not being checked because of this very loose touch approach.
It's also not a function that remains in local authority under local authority control anymore. And so the separation of planning and building control, and the fact that building control is now essentially privatised, or that there's an option to go through a private provider, means that there are loopholes, and we're seeing a lot of schemes that are coming forward that you would have thought should have been picked up through building control but have not.
I agree, and daylight space standards are not building regulations issues anyway. Accessibility doesn't apply to any conversions, even category 1, the baseline. I only discovered that 2 months ago. That's why they can get away with such tiny showers. You can't even, there's not even knee room, I promise you, in some of these, and that's because not even the baseline that we've had since 1999, I think it is, applies to conversions. So there's all sorts of loopholes there. Most planning authorities will make a referral, or often make a referral to building regulations, and once a scheme is logged in the system, there's often a reporting there, so that opportunity is missed. And I can promise you that I would say the majority, certainly a very large proportion of the schemes that I've been looking at, I've also been looking at the building regulations records on the planning portal for those same schemes, and I've found very, very few at all. So I don't know if it's law that those drawings and applications must be lodged, or whether whether it's legitimate that they're not there for some reason. And I know for a fact that Newbury House, one of the ones that set this hair running, was occupied by very vulnerable people for over a year without sign-off from building regulations. And I was asked to write into the council at Redbridge, put that in writing so that they were given the resources to make an inspection to make sure that those occupants were at least safe, because there were 3 outstanding issues pending in the planning portal records. One was soundproofing, one was ventilation, and the third was fire safety. And I spoke to the building control officer who had last seen it, and he said, I cannot believe there are people in there.
Lewin, you're a local authority officer, so you have to deal with some of this.
Mm-hmm.
What's your reaction to what you've heard?
I mean, it is fairly typical. So, but there's a huge range of providers as well. So you do get quality development as well as poor quality development. There is an expectation from communities that planning has a lot more control over things than actually in some cases it does have. I think sort of looking wider at the ability really of the planning authority to plan properly for an area, that's now being significantly undermined, particularly in relation to provision of employment space within Brent. So yes, permitted development is allowing residential dwellings to be created, but it's now actually, we've got rid of the empty offices that were sitting there for many, many years that were unviable to be occupied as office and effectively were mothballed. We're now seeing, certainly in Brent, fully occupied offices, because the rents aren't as good as the benefits to the developer or the landowner as a residential scheme. We're now seeing businesses being booted out of offices, and those offices coming under the prior approval process, and us not being able to find new premises for businesses within the borough. So that's a significant issue for us, particularly with the London plan, the draft London plan coming through and telling us that we need to be a provide capacity borough for employment uses as well. So we are looking to bring in more controls and remove some of these permitted development rights through Article 4 directions.
Paul, you've jumped. I was going to talk about demolition, but ask questions about that. But I want to jump ahead and really talk about what's been the impact then of permitted development rights on local economies and in terms of employment. And you've sort of started talking about that.
We have seen some sort of.
Because your borough had, I once looked a couple of years ago, and you had the highest number of prior approvals of any borough.
Yeah, so in theory,
like 67% of your office accommodation.
We've lost, if all the prior approvals are implemented, we've lost about 110,000 square metres of office, or over 1 million square feet of office to residential. And that office isn't just within high streets or in random locations. A lot of it is within pretty serious industrial estates as well. So it not only has an impact on the occupiers of those buildings, the commercial occupiers, but the surrounding areas as well. So once you introduce a residential use within an industrial estate, that's operating on a 24-hour basis with smelly and noisy uses around it, those businesses are also adversely impacted upon. And that's where the planning system would deal with those types of matters, to ensure that the development occurs in the right place, has the right conditions attached to it, to ensure that noise, the noise is not adversely affecting the residents within the block, etc., which the current prior approval process has absolutely no controls over whatsoever. So it's a sort of twin impact on employment. But some of the residential environments that are being created, we come to the building has no amenity space, and they step outside and they are literally in a service yard or in a car park or hard standing associated with the business next door, because a lot of business estates are just buildings piled into an area with shared courtyards and shared facilities.
Who wants to come in?
Tony.
Tony.
I'd just ask, we've obviously had an awful lot of negativity, and I don't disagree with lots of what's been said.
Yeah.
Most of you must have seen at least some good PD schemes that have been good design. Have you got a feel for, you know, I know it's very hard to ask this, but what percentage are good design? What percentage are at least adequate? Because we're hearing a lot about the horror stories.
Well, externally, the schemes are only as good as the existing building because you're not allowed to change the external facade.
Sure.
So the nice-looking office buildings that have been converted will make nice-looking housing from the outside. They won't typically have balconies, though, for example, or any private outdoor space. But so externally, they're as good as the buildings that they come from.
Of course, but I'm looking more in terms of, do they function well as a home? You know, we obviously know what you've just said with respect. It's about, do they actually function well as a home, or are they truly substandard, which is the message that A.M. Copley and others give out. And I think that's the case for many, but not all.
Absolutely. I think it's a real mix. And internally, I don't see many reasons why most office blocks couldn't be converted satisfactorily to housing. Not all of them are going to be great. But you generally start with fairly open floor plans, fairly sparse columns. Windows do tend to have offices. Offices do tend to have windows. Sorry. So daylight isn't often a problem. Isn't very often a problem in offices. It can be in these other light industrial things like the Watford shed, which is an absolute disgrace. So I do think it's possible to convert many office buildings to housing that's good enough.
But it's been done, isn't it?
And it's been done, and there are examples. But I have to say that most of the ones that are acceptable or better than acceptable have needed planning permission, have either sought to do it anyway, because that's a decent thing to do, or have needed it because some external modifications are necessary to make a nice place to live, not just acceptable dwellings.
So we haven't got any figures that say
But
10% are awful,
I think
10% are great, 80% are okay.
No, but if I can just finish, I think internally, the results are very largely the quality is generally determined by the developer. They don't have to cut these big open floor plates into skinny studio flats. That's what many of them choose to do. But that's not the building forcing them down that route. It's not because of fitting in with a column module or window spacing. It's to get more units in. It's as simple as that. So they have a lot of choice about how they use the space.
This is a popular subject,
yes, Jessica.
Everybody wants to speak.
And Jack and Henry want to come in, so please do. By the way, we're moving around, but one of the things I am interested in is the impact of PD rights on office to resi, on local employment. And this point was being made by Paul that you're getting people being turfed out. And so these are not empty offices, many of them, but they actually have quite a lot of occupants and businesses in them.
Well, just cover both points, maybe just briefly. Your question there, Tony, on percentages. It's a very difficult figure to establish because I have personally visited every single permitted development scheme, office to residential scheme in Camden. My colleagues visited every single one in Croydon as part of our research. And you can only obviously get a sense from the outside in terms of those site visits. Now and again, we were invited in by the odd resident and we got to see the inside. And we also tried to get residents' views through a survey, but it was very, very difficult to get that data. So you're really relying on the desktop research that you then do, looking at the floor plans that may or may not be submitted as part of the prior approval. So we were able to look at a lot of those, but it's only really a selection that have those floor plans that you can look at. So it's a very, very laborious process trying to get a handle on the question that you were asking. But we did see some good examples, and especially in Camden where the values are high, and converting these sort of old industrial piano warehouses into residential is obviously a very profitable business, and it makes sense for developers to make those into very nice homes because the values are high and they can really achieve the rents there. In other places where the investment doesn't really pay off, that's where you're seeing the poorer quality in our experience. On the issue of local economies, I think, when we did our work in Camden, where it's obviously been a big issue in terms of the loss of small businesses there, the view of the economic development officers was just huge frustration because they had spent years intervening at the point at which planning permission was granted to make sure that they would get replacement employment floor space in schemes that were developing on employment sites, and they can't do that anymore. They're obviously also seeing the loss of these small businesses from buildings that are very attractive residential conversion opportunities. So when Camden, in 2013, when they did that piece of work, or 2014 when they did that piece of work, looking at what had happened at the point which the permitted development came into force. So in the 9 years prior to 2013, they'd lost 60,000 square metres of office space. And just the year following after the introduction of permitted development, they lost 23,000 in just 1 year. So that is quite stark. Obviously, they then went down the Article 4 direction route and managed to save some sites. But their view was that they lost so much in those initial years that the damage was really done at that point.
Yes, I did talk to the Camden bid, and their view is that they've lost so much of the low-hanging fruit. The rents have gone up, and yes, there might be some nice conversions, but people were turfed out to make those conversions. So they're not just lost office space; they've lost the jobs, and I think the conversions, they've got different people renting it.
I think it should be said, even under the current planning system, without permitted development, planning authorities have done this to small industry as well, undervalued it.
Yeah,
but just this.
Yeah, we were talking about this particular business.
Yeah. So the London Plan has some very strong policies now. The new London Plan around the need to master plan area. If you're going to lose employment space, that needs to be done through a master planning process.
I wish I believed you.
Those policies, that's the ambition.
Yeah.
But obviously, if these conversions, take place as you're suggesting in Brent, very isolated conversions with no consideration of the wider context, it's a problem.
Everyone wants to come in. So
yes, did you want to come in first, Jack? Sorry, Tom. Before we.
No, so it was in response to something that Julie was saying in a question following up something Julie was saying in response to Tony. So I'll come in at the end.
Yeah.
I'm not going to endear myself to anyone in the room for what I'm about to say, but I'm going to
say, Mr. Airy, that's why you're here.
When Paul talked about local authorities providing or helping to provide office space and planners being undermined, it doesn't matter if the plan's undermined, and local authorities shouldn't be in the business of trying to provide office space, in my opinion. The choice of spatial location for a firm should be best left to the firm. Planners lack the information to make informed decisions about these difficult trade-offs between that space that people need and location. Those decisions are best left to individuals, households and firms. And I know you're going to disagree with me on that, but that's fine. But more broadly, the question is, what is the legitimate role of the state in this, in a building or a piece of land, shifting use? I don't think for the reasons I just laid out, I don't think planners need to have that much of a say on that issue, and I get that you're going to disagree with me on that. And also, it's worth mentioning that the use class order was last defined in, I think I'm right in saying, in 1987. The internet wasn't invented then. The economy has changed hugely. You need the use class order needs to be updated massively. It needs to accommodate pop-up uses, a range of high street uses like more culture, flexibility in time as well as space, and also a general residential use class. So we're kind of arguing over something which is so out of date anyway in terms of how can it about flexibility in that system. And really we need to be looking at it more broadly as well. But I get that's a slightly different issue. And also, for those reasons, this is why planners and the planning lobby and don't like this policy, it takes power away from them.
Could I just come? As you say, Jack, I might disagree with this.
Playing the pantomime villain.
Do you think there's a role for the state?
Well, in planning, of course they do, but I absolutely, yeah.
What is that? Well, I would like to ask you.
in
land use decisions.
Because we're well into this meeting,
Yeah.
I don't really want to get
No,
involved in
It's a
philosophical
joke.
discussion.
No, I just wondered what you thought the role
Because
of
if
planning
you do that, I'll end up on Jack's side.
So I just Policy Exchange are doing a big project on this at the moment on planning reform for the 21st century, and you'll be able to see that in the next few months. Sorry.
So I'm going to just come back on something Jack said and then mention briefly about the two wider points being discussed. So the point about it only being planners in the planning lobby disagreeing with this policy, I think is a flawed argument. We've spoken to many business groups who fundamentally disagree with this, so local enterprise partnerships who are actively lobbying against this because of the loss of office space, because of the impact on inward investment, and then coming on to the issue of what councils have said about the lack of office space and the impact of the policy. I'll read out just a couple of quick quotes. The first is, and these are anonymous, but from London boroughs. It is a disaster for housing and also has very badly affected our commercial centre due to the loss of office space. In addition, the local charitable sector have been finding themselves without places to operate from. Also, building residential accommodations can affect existing businesses adversely, for instance, nighttime economy, music venues. And another quote just saying the negative impacts on the local economy include opportunities for inward investment loss, so crucial film, digital agencies looking for office space, and this is from a local enterprise partnership just outside of London. And then to come back on the point, I've sorry, lost my place. I'll let someone else go.
Can I quickly make one just small point I thought to make? There's actually an argument as well that the permitted development extension since 2014 has helped the way for new office providers like WeWork. Like businesses want way different offices than in the 1970s. They want higher quality, more flexible, just much different commercial space. So in a sense, like the fact that these offices are these buildings are no longer used as offices has allowed new forms of office to come forward, and often they are quite affordable as well. So I mean, that's it.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you want to come in, Dr. Ferm?
I did, but I've forgotten what it was.
You did, or you did?
Tom?
I'll come back.
Did you want to?
This was actually, funny enough, I sort of agree with Jack that the used class order needs to be updated, but definitely not junked. Just to Julia, I had a question. I don't think it comes up elsewhere. Energy efficiency. Presumably, when these places are converted, they just maintain whatever, if it's single glazed windows, you end up with single glazed windows. Is that what you end up with? People getting very high energy bills as well because these buildings aren't very well insulated?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I do know that Part L of the building regulations has lesser standards for conversion, so they wouldn't be required to meet new build standards, but I don't know if they're required to go some way towards that. But just related to that, the worst kind of the worst configuration for a home in terms of climate change mitigation is a deep, narrow, single room with a deep, narrow space with a single window, because you have no potential for cross ventilation, for example. The depth means that daylight will be restricted; it will only penetrate so far into the room. So it's. For me, it's not the worst element of many of these homes, but it is certainly another important point, because, my goodness, if we don't take, if we haven't got the message about climate change now, then when will we? And these will be extremely challenging to get close to zero carbon.
Thank you for that.
Could we move on to...
moving on to...
Sorry.
I want to move on to the question about demolition, that part of the government's consultation. Now, perhaps we start with Julia. What impact do you think demolition is going to have on London? The demolition of demolition and rebuild. This is demolition and rebuild of of anything, I think, which has got permitted development. And now remember, I want you to bring in light industry here too, because that only came in October 2017. Now light industry can be well, it's PD rights, and we haven't got any figures really yet for that, but because it's relatively new. But when you consider possibly the demolition of so much of this, of what is actually about behind the high streets, and also about the offices as well, what do you think?
Well, there's a tiny part of me that thinks, at least if these buildings are demolished, they will be recreated with residential use in mind, and possibly more likely to have design professionals involved, because it's a bigger job making a building from scratch. But the overwhelming part of me thinks this is complete madness. Why do we have a planning system if it's okay to pull down a building and give free rein to whatever goes back? I really can't understand how that's compatible with a development control process or land use or building communities, placemaking. Of course, again, it's not impossible. If you have committed clients, great developers, good designers, then actually none of those people need rules because they do the decent thing anyway. But I think what permitted development has exposed is that there are too many. It's still a small minority, but there are too many developers in particular who just don't have either the skills or the moral compass or the expertise to do the decent thing. And I just think it's quite mad and a massive risk. I would like to see the planning system streamlined and improved. I mean, who wouldn't? It's as frustrating for us as it is for anybody else. But those who call for more deregulation, liberalisation, I think be careful what you wish for. And I really do think we have seen some extraordinary examples which should make us very grateful we have a planning system at all.
Okay, who else wants to come in? Demolition, the impact of demolition.
I mean, I sort of agree with what's been said. I think the concern for us as a planning authority is that essentially what the consultation outlined would be essentially us having to sign off loads of conditions, etc., which is good because it means that the development's, of a higher quality. But it's just planning permission called something different. It has the same processes, the same expense for the authority, but it doesn't get the same fee for determining that planning application. And also what it does is also negate the need for planning obligations usually associated with planning permissions as well. So the issue, it doesn't address, the consultation didn't address things like, the amount of affordable housing that should be provided. Is that consistent with local plan policies, or is it just totally ignored? What about contributions to transport infrastructure, etc.? Some things will be covered by community infrastructure levy, but there are still elements of planning obligations that we seek that are not covered by these permitted development rights, and developers get away with developing in the community but not necessarily addressing the adverse impacts of their developments on social infrastructure and on things like transportation, etc.
While I've got you, can I just ask you, the new PD right on light industry, which obviously the demolition, if it actually goes ahead as the government seems to be minded to proceed with, would that affect? I'm just thinking, we had a site visit to Alperton, and we were aware that there were lots and lots of makers and mechanics and all sorts of people just behind your high street.
Yeah. And
this is apparently true. We know this is true in many, many parts of London. It's all a non-designated light industry.
Yeah.
Now that's just what would happen with the, I don't know if the conversions are yet going ahead, if there are any. But what about demolition?
I don't think demolition of light industrial was part of the consultation, so it focused on office.
Just office?
Yeah, office to residential. So in Brent, the loss of B1 light industry and B8 storage, which is also a permitted development, although B8's now stopped, they're both temporary. The loss hasn't been as significant, so that tends to indicate that there's probably a lot more physical work needed to amend those buildings into residential dwellings, whereas with the office blocks it's probably less expensive to do that and certainly probably more profitable to do that. So whilst we are concerned, because there have been some changes of use of B1C and B8 within industrial estates, which is compromising those estates to some extent, the move so far hasn't been so significant compared to the office, which seems much easier for developers to do. And both of those are temporary. So at the moment there isn't any indication from government that it intends to carry on with the B1C. That finishes in 2020. So we'll see.
Well, that's interesting. I'm glad for that clarification. Jack, you wanted to come in?
On the demolition point, I mean, again, like the office to residential permitted development, it will mean outdated and redundant buildings are reused, or maybe not reused, the land will be used again for more value to the society and to the economy. Second point, the expansion of permitted development in this way, it offers a chance to address some of the issues with it, I think, to kind of reset the policy. I mean, we can look at, again, at, like, the matters for prior approval for this permitted development. Like, in our response to the government's consultation, we said that one of the matters should be that there should be compliance with space standards for this specific permitted development. And thirdly, the costs of demolition and reconstruction are quite significant. So this permitted development is only like to be viable in kind of, it's only going to be used in high value areas. So I don't know how much volume it will bring. It's hard to say.
Does anyone else want to come in on this?
Just the point about the collection of Section 106 and SIL, that although under permitted development, in principle, those schemes are still liable, we found that most local authorities weren't collecting any SIL on those schemes, and that's because there's the loophole. So if the building's been partially occupied in the 3 years prior, then it's not still liable, and that's not very difficult to prove. So you're missing out on both those sets of contributions.
One more very quick one, may I?
Yes.
London has led the way in many ways for a long time now in terms of housing quality and the standards that it sets. And we have the London Housing Design Guide and the SPG, and the new draft London Plan is upholding a whole raft of very good standards, living standards. We've talked about some of them here. I can't see how it would be sensible or fair to Londoners for new buildings. I mean, I can't see it with conversions either, but even more with new buildings. When you start with a clean site, why on earth would you not want those standards to be manifest in this brand new residential building just because there used to be an office block on the site? Why would you want any lesser standard for the interior or indeed the exterior? It's a fantastic opportunity, isn't it, to do something that is compliant with some very carefully thought through and hard fought for standards. So I really have trouble seeing how. I really have difficulty in seeing who benefits and why. I don't mind the idea of presumption in favour, for converting office blocks. I think we sort of got that anyway. Everyone in London knows that there's huge pressure for more housing. So local authorities are going to say yes to anything that's good enough, whether it's new or converted. I mean, and they do, and the graphs show that. I think it's in your report, Tom, isn't it? Those huge number of permissions that haven't yet been instigated. So I really, do question the extent to which we're seeing the planning process as the problem.
On that, just to say, we've exceeded, London's exceeded, every year for the last 10 years, exceeded the number of planning permissions, exceeded the London plan target.
Yeah, that's right.
Every year.
Yeah.
On that point, a former assistant housing director here, Jamie Ratcliffe, GLA, he wrote a paper for Policy Exchange on this exact issue around the number of planning permissions that get converted, as in they get built, and it's around 50% or so. I think it's gone up and down a bit over the past decade or so. But his point was we kind of assume nothing's ever going to go wrong in the development process, and we kind of plan accordingly. So in the draft New London plan, I think it's 65,000 new homes when there's a target of 66,000. So we release just enough land, assuming nothing's going to go wrong. And so it's just like a side point to that, where really we need to be really. If we follow his idea was we need contingency. So he was saying contingency of 50%. So really we should be releasing our plan for 100,000 homes, which is obviously going to be very politically difficult with me going onto the green belt around London. Sorry, I'm straying way beyond our brief here.
Oh. You are a bit.
But I suppose bring it back to community development. It's another way of bringing volume.
Let's try and track this.
Sorry.
I appreciate the intervention there.
Yeah.
Mr. You finished, Nicky?
I have finished.
Very quickly, Mr. Smith, how often do developers secure prior approval on permitted development rights and then subsequently seek planning permission? And why do they do this?
We have heard anecdotally of several examples of developers doing that, and it's kind of known now in the industry as sort of bagging a prior approval. So you kind of get that through the door. You get the conversion without any investment in affordable housing, any development contributions, and you do that, and then you think about, okay, what else could we do with the building that would need planning permission. One of the sort of worrying trends that we're seeing is within one building, so within the same building, units that have been built with planning permission that meet space standards, they have private amenity space, they're in a general good quality of design, adjacent to, in the same building, units that are being built through permitted developments that are 50 square metres, fall well below the standards that a local authority would assume and would expect in an area. And that's a kind of form of sort of social segregation, we think, in some ways, and a real risk of creating that I guess a new form of segregation in that sense.
Thank you. Dr. Ferm?
We did quite a lot of work on this, looking at, because we would typically get lists from local authorities on all the permitted development notifications that they'd received. And when you sort of started drilling down the data, you would find that many of those notifications were actually for the same building. And developers were going back each time with seeking greater numbers. So one example here in Croydon, first prior approval that was sought in 2013 was for 9 flats that were all meeting the national space standards. A year later, they went back with a proposal for 28 flats, and in 2015 for 32 flats. And by that stage, they were of 16 to 22 square metres. So it, without having interviewed that particular developer, but it did look as though they were really looking to see how far they could push it.
Yeah. It takes longer than a planning application, quite often. They go back for prior approval so many times, they could have done a planning application in less time. These guys got, it's very small, but these guys got permission to change the windows of this office block before asking for residential use. They sought full planning permission to change the windows to suit a residential floor plan, which they intended and then did submit for prior approval, having got the local authority to say, well, yes, we don't mind you having new windows. So that was cynically planned. You can see, you could probably just see from here how run down this building is. So there was clearly an ulterior motive. But they said yes, okay, you can have new windows in different places, and then they put in the plans, the residential floor plans for which those windows were designed, and they got prior approval because they could not be given prior approval. And another thing I've come across a number of times, and the Watford shed, an example, the developer said to the journalist, not me, of course, I wasn't there, but he said, "Oh, well, we do plan to put windows into these 6 flats that'll be in the roof space. We'll just put in a planning application for that, for roof lights or something later on." So they use, in a way, I mean, they're having their cake and eat it both ways, because the narrative will be, well, you've given permission, you've given us permission, prior approval to do this. We're going to do it. Surely you'd rather these homes had windows or roof lights than had no daylight at all. So the local authority would be silly at that point to refuse if he believes that developer is intent on carrying out executing his prior approval. But that's a complete kind of full circle of exploiting a loophole, isn't it?
In theory, then, would that mean that...
And it's happening a lot.
A local authority could essentially be bounced into putting some windows in where there was an issue with overlooking, because otherwise they would be refusing for rooms, in theory, rooms to have natural light.
Well, they're in a really difficult position, aren't they? To the extent that they have to make a judgment about what's the best overall outcome for the new building and the residents, given where we are with this developer who's determined to go ahead one way or the other. What's the best outcome we can secure from something that we only have partial control over? And the other thing I've heard is that, and you may know this better than me, but I've had people writing to me saying we're seeing new homes going through the planning system, a couple without windows, certainly quite a lot now that only have roof lights, and people are saying, well, this is perfectly acceptable. What do you mean? There are all these office to residential conversions. Some of them don't have windows at all. So why is it okay for them to do it, but if I come to you with a planning application, you're saying no? And the same pressure is happening to space. If it's okay to have a 13 square metre flat in a converted office building, why couldn't I build a nice new flat of 13 square metres? The government seems to think it's fine.
This goes to the heart of the issue, doesn't it?
It does.
Legitimacy of the planning system. It's how it undermines it.
We'll move on from that, if we may. Assemblymember Copley about housing supply.
Yes, if I could come to Jessica first. So it goes back to this question of whether or not the introduction of these permitted development rights has contributed to an increase in residential housing supply in London above and beyond what could have been achieved via a full planning application.
So in our report, we tried to get a handle on that. There is so on page 19, I can kind of pull that out for you.
Could you just tell us the title of the report?
So this is the RICS Research Trust report on assessing the impacts of extending permitted development rights to office to residential conversion. So here it says that between 2009 to 2012, so before PD rights, a total of 39,000 residential units were delivered in London through conversions of B1 floor space, through full planning permission. That's 13,000 units per year on average. Subsequent to the extension of PD in 2013, between 2013 and 2015, 4,757 residential units were delivered through office to residential PD conversions. So the question is, whether that is over and above some additional figures on full planning permissions, or not.
Could you go ahead? What were the figures for office to residential conversions with full planning permission pre-PD rights?
About 13,000 a year.
And what's the total with full planning permission and with PD rights? So
I don't have the plus. So what I have is through PD was 4,757 on average. In that total, which is 2,378 units per year.
Yeah.
So I will check with Ben, because he might have done that calculation separately, whether we've done that, whether we got the plus.
Yeah, it'd be good to get those numbers, because that would indicate an uptick.
Do you send it to the chair so that we all get a copy?
Yes, yeah.
Really, the question is whether or not resources are being diverted or whether these are additional homes that are providing something different, something new on top of what was being delivered through planning applications.
But I think I'll come to you in a moment. I think I'm right in saying that if you compare London and Glasgow in the period where after permitted development rights were introduced in England, but of course not in Scotland, Glasgow also saw an increase in office to residential without permitted development rights. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Henry,
just quickly follow up on that. We've just completed analysis with the UCL team on 30 examples, mostly across London, a few across the rest of the southeast. There's over 2,000 housing units that have come through these 30 schemes, and we've seen so one developer, one large house builder who was responsible for one of them, and one of our concerns is about how this is diverting resources from major house builders who would instead be looking at new build in line with planning permission, and instead are going down this route because they see it as being simple. So the reason I mentioned that is this question about whether or not it's additional housing is subject to debate, and we don't have that information yet.
Julie,
I've got a stat here. It says the first year of PDR legislation generated 2,274% more office to residential conversions than the yearly average prior to that.
Well, that kind of establishes it, doesn't it?
And another one here. In 2006, 900 normal applications were lodged. That was the highest number in the 10-year period prior to the introduction of PDR. In 2014, 6,500 PDR schemes were notified. So it went from 900 to a high of 900 to 6,500.
Didn't you say there were 13,000?
Yeah, so it'll be good to just...
Office to residential, full planning. And is that in London?
This was London, these are London figures, but we do need to distinguish between notifications received and home
applications granted. Well, maybe we could, you could write to us afterwards and we could get that, because that would be interesting. Jack, do you want to comment on this issue of whether or not this has contributed more than would have been delivered anyway?
I mean, I don't have much to add to what's been said. I was just going to point to a paper by another think tank, Project for Modern Democracy, whose paper, I think it was written last year, said that since 2014, the Office to Residential Permitted Development Policy has delivered nearly 90,000 new homes, the equivalent of a city the size of Oxford or Exeter. And it's applied only to existing buildings, so it has involved the use of no new land, thus safeguarding, according to the Project for Modern Democracy, 2,750 hectares of greenfield. That's their spin on it, so that's just another way of looking at it.
I think we're going to need to see that written down data, because if as Park has said, then it would indicate that yes, it certainly has had a contribution.
On the point of diverting resources, obviously again that's a decision for the house builder. If that's their decision, then that's fine. If we're diverting resources from building, let's say new builds on greenfield sites into the redevelopment of existing buildings, and you talk about the climate crisis earlier, then isn't that probably a good thing in a sense? Like it's using, protecting greenfield land, which is clearly a priority of this government and the mayor.
That's more
conservation
than environmental. If you're building buildings if you're getting buildings that are very energy inefficient and you're leaking, CO2, whereas in theory you could build carbon neutral homes on the green belt if that was a government policy.
I would very much support that. That's my comment about 20 minutes ago. But it also brings in much more private investment into these kind of many redundant office blocks, and this is a key point. It's bringing in companies suddenly want to invest in these buildings and make them better. Okay, then trying to make them into homes as well. And then I know some people disagree whether they're a home or not, or if they're just a box, but they are bringing in additional investment. So there is an opportunity to actually improve the energy efficiency of them too.
But the counter to that would be that as I say, there was an uptick post 2015 in Glasgow as well, with no permitted development rights. All what you're getting is more profits for developers, because they're shortchanging local people who aren't getting local infrastructure, they aren't getting affordable housing, and the residents of those buildings are often getting an inferior product.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was more of a maybe that was a rhetorical question. So, Julia, you wanted to...
What they've done in the process is raise the value of rather run-down office blocks, indeed all office blocks, because now every office block in the country potentially can command residential value. You've still got to pay for the conversion, but the profits that some of them are making are eye-watering, and I believe it's slowing down across the country, presumably the easy wins have been used already, but also because they're so much more expensive to buy. If they're changing, as soon as you get prior approval, they often change hands, and again, if you track the records, you see the applications are made by different people each time quite often, so they change hands sequentially until someone decides to do it. And you look up what they're paying for the office. It's all deeply tedious, as you say, but they're often paying double on the back of having a prior approval to start with.
Can I just come on to another question? Actually, we touched on it, Julia, because the question was whether or not these homes are being built faster, and you said often they're not, because they're going through several iterations to increase the number of units. Is there any sort of quantifiable evidence that anyone's got on how fast, on average, these these are developed compared to a full planning application? Yes.
I mean, certainly the developers we spoke to definitely did think it was a quicker
way
process. That was why they were attracted to it, and they, faster and cheaper. They didn't have to pay so many consultants to do all their reports, and so in a sense, we found that it brought in a new type of developer. There were developers who came into existence because of PD rights coming forward, who saw it as a business opportunity. It's a new type of business model. It's not Berkeley Homes. It's not the big established house builders who are building on greenfield who are now doing these conversions. It's a whole new category of developer.
Can I just come in and ask Jessica Ferm, you've done work, haven't you? I think you've done work on impact on the office market, have you? Because we haven't really heard very much about the flip side of this. What is it doing to...
No, we haven't. I mean, we've summarised some of the reports that have come out from the British Council of Offices on that. The GLA 2017, your own London office policy review looked at that in 2017. So there is some data in that report, and the British Council for Offices, I think, released 2 reports, but we haven't done our own research on the office market.
Okay, we need to just look at that, I think, as well.
So we've got on record what the implicit sort of floor space lost and what impact that may have on jobs. Has anybody else got anything to add to that? No, good.
Well, I think Paul talked quite a lot about how, that people are being turfed out, and how it's hard for you to find office space, isn't it? And employment space.
That's on record.
And Jack said the state shouldn't intervene in that.
Yeah, exactly. We've got that on record. Assembly Member Copley, could we move on to your question about quality?
Well, actually, I think we've covered we've covered that, I think, quite well, the main question. So unless anyone has anything absolutely burning to add on the issue of whether or not these are generally of a high quality.
Can I just add something from this recent evidence that we've done, which, as I mentioned before, is there's over 2,000 units that have been created from 30 schemes, and it hopefully partly helps answer Tony's previous question about whether or not some of these are good quality. And we think there are instances where this is done to a good standard. The figures are that so 14% of these 2,000 units complied with space standards, with some of them being significantly under the space standards, studio flats of 15 square metres not being uncommon. One of the most, again, worrying things for us is that less than 1% of these units had any access to private amenity space, and the majority of them didn't have any green or open space within 250 metres of the development. And then lastly, that 85% of the units were only single aspect dwellings. So as has been said, it's hard to get an idea about what these places are like to live in. There's a lack of information about the internal layout of them. We're going on what we have from floor plans when they're available. That's our data.
Okay, thank you. Anything else on quality that we've not already covered?
I think that many of these homes actually fail the Fitness for Human Habitation Act brought in March of this year.
So do you think there'll be challenges by residents?
I don't think there will be challenges by residents, because the residents who live here, or who live in the ones that are at this end of the spectrum, have very little choice about where else to go. But I definitely think there should be challenges. I've got evidence from tribunal cases in Leeds of larger homes than many of these. They've only recently won these cases, but they have been deemed Category 1 hazards under the Housing Health and Safety rating system. For space and crowding is the criteria that covers space. And the judge ruled that she ruled importantly for the first time, as far as I know, that the nationally described space standard is the benchmark against which landlords should now be assessing their properties under the health and safety rating system, even though it's not mentioned in that document because it hasn't been updated since 2002. Nonetheless, there's enough wording in there that says that, or whatever standards pertain at the time. So she had no hesitation in saying what we should be comparing it with is the government, particularly as it's a government's brought out standard anyway. This is my benchmark for assessing whether this is too small to be, so small as to be dangerous. And she ruled that they were. But I don't know of a case in a permitted development yet where that's been the case. But also daylight is, that's another Category 1 hazard, insufficient daylight.
So just finally, my last question was whether or not requiring permitted development conversions to comply with the minimum space standards would be sufficient to resolve quality concerns. I'm going to assume that most of the panel are going to say no, it would not be sufficient. Jack, I'm wondering whether you think that would be sufficient, or whether there's anything else you think should.
In our response to the government's consultation late last year, earlier this year, we were saying that one of the tests, if there is a loophole that exists, and we talked about it quite a lot, and if the government wanted to close this, then it could make one of the tests for prior approval that proposed development should give regard to nationally described space standards. That is different to compliance with space standards. Even though we were sympathetic to the idea, it might impact other parts of government policy which are not related to permitted development, e.g. building regulations.
Just the moment you say should or have regard, you're just leaving, a massive loophole. I can't quite see practically how the planning authority would then be able to reject.
I mean, the simplest way of doing it, if they really want to do this, is to put it in building regulations, put size into building regulations, and I think that's something the government should look at.
Is there anything else that you think, other than minimum space standards, that you think should be a requirement for permitted development prior approval?
In an ideal world where we have a kind of reform planning system, I think it should have to comply with matters related to design and style, maybe not style, but various parameters around kind of building materials and design and stuff like that. And that's the role rather than, I don't think there should be a question of what should I get? Planning, I don't think planners should be able to say that there should be one land use or another. There are special circumstances where they should be, absolutely. But I think in my ideal planning system, they would it'd be about design and style and stuff like that, rather, and obviously building regulations at the same time.
Okay.
Would you agree that daylight is essential?
Yes.
That's another one.
That's another one.
Natural ventilation, or do you think aircon
You're
is
going
okay?
beyond my knowledge here.
Fire safety.
Well, fire safety is a matter for building
regulations. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
Insulation, noise insulation.
Sorry, slightly going back. I mean, you made the point that if a 15 square meter apartment is good enough at 1,300 pounds per month. I mean, surely what it shows on one way of looking at it is it's supporting it shouldn't be that small a flat. One way of looking at it is that there is such a housing shortage, the result of a number of reasons, including planning, that actually there are people who are having to live there. So the more it will become difficult to build new homes, this challenge will show up on the other side, where actually we will still have the same population and they will still need to live somewhere and will be giving away somewhere else. Having said that, so probably will have to find a medium whereby actually enough homes can be built and all the standards that we all would like to see, they can be applied. We just have, in our view, there were three main issues with permitted development to office to resi, and which we proposed to central government that they be, any permitted development or whatever they call it for airspace development, they be taken into regard. One was post-space standards, so we wanted airspace developments to comply with space standards and London design. There was no provision of affordable housing. We want any airspace development, permitted development right to provide affordable housing. It should be policy compliant, and there was avoidance of, or not a requirement of planning fee, and this should be paid. The challenge is that with planning, with all due respect and regard to enhancing standards, yes, everybody would like to see them. We don't want to come into get to a position or where the challenges are. Some of the current planning regulations, they probably are more suitable in terms of, you come up with, you're a very big house builder, you develop all those expertise that you can get around them necessarily, and you can achieve the results that you need. There needs to be some kind of balance over here, whereby actually things can happen, because we do need housing. There is no, otherwise if we don't produce enough housing, then the result would be that even the poor quality homes, I mean people, it's not, I have every sympathy with people living there, but it's not they're forced by the developer, it is forced by the lack of housing. They're having to live there. So there is some kind of thing.
Which is, of course, they're forced. It's, of course, a reason to make sure that this housing is of a decent size and quality, because otherwise people are being forced to live in
those housing.
Yeah,
so, but at the same
housing.
time, if we don't give regard to that, the current housing planning regime, along with some other factors, actually have resulted in the lack of housing supply as well. So where is how far we want to go for? Our proposal would be.
Thank you. I'll leave that question section there. Thank you very much.
I was going to ask you a question next, which is so obvious. I don't know whether or not to ask it, but I will. And just surprise me if I'm not going to. What type and size of household are catered for by the dwellings delivered through PDR conversions? Unless you're going to tell me a whole load of family housing is being delivered by PDR conversions.
Studios and one-bedroom flats.
Studios and one-bedroom flats. That's pretty much the consensus.
Lots of them lived in by families.
Yeah.
Indeed. I'm well acquainted with the overcrowding issues in this city. Let's move on if we can, therefore. Thank you for that. If I now rush forward to some of the mitigation mechanisms. Assembly Member Devonish.
Right, I'm starting off, I'm being told, with Jack on the mitigation mechanisms. How could the PDR scheme be modified to 1. Ensure quality dwellings are delivered, 2. Require affordable housing contributions, and 3. Ensure only suitable offices are converted, preserving required employment space? Start with that, shall we?
So it's 1, quality, 2,
affordable housing contributions.
And 3, suitable.
Yes.
Well, it kind of talks about the quality issue slightly like
yes,
5
please,
minutes ago, and how it might be vetted. On affordable housing, again, if I go back to the paper the Policy Exchange published in 2011, they recommended that that developers, to capture some of the gains of relaxing the use class order for the public benefit, you might kind of do a flat rate charge per converted housing unit, fixed at the same level as the new homes bonus, and that's what I refer to in that question. On the third, how can we only convert suitable officers? That is not possible in the way that the policy is done at the moment. It's a certain use class, and there's no judgment on whether it's suitable or not. I mean, I suppose it's for, sorry, I sound like a horrible free marketeer again, but it's for the market to decide what is a suitable thing to convert to residential.
And are there any other existing or potential avenues for mitigating any negative impacts on PDRs in your view?
Excuse me.
Not that coming to mind.
Does anybody else specifically want to comment on those questions, you don't feel you have to.
I mean, I would just say that once you start looking at all the other conditions you can put on and how you can ensure that affordable housing is delivered and how you can make sure that you achieve economic development goals, you're getting back to something that looks like a planning application. So I would just question why we're going down that road.
Yeah, the challenge in any reform will be maintaining the certainty and clarity that the policy brings.
Thank you. And then moving on to Article 4 exemptions for Paul. Could you please provide a brief overview of the process for implementing Article 4 exemptions, and why has Brent Council introduced the Article 4, and has this action been effective? Thank you.
Okay. So the General Permitted Development Order allows local authorities, with reasons, to remove permitted development rights through an Article 4 direction. It's a relatively simple process to do, depending on whether you need to consult individual property owners or not. Because of the extent of the Article 4s that we've done, we've sought to not send letters to individual property owners, but to put up site notices and publicise it through the media, which are allowed to do in the regulations as well. And what we've done is remove the permit. This is only at the moment within significant industrial locations and locally significant industrial locations. To stop, because essentially those are the areas where our best industrial land is. So we were seeing development undermining the opportunities for businesses to run properly as businesses within those areas. So that's where we've limited our Article 4 directions to at the moment. So there's a period of consultation. We notify, we put in public notices. I think it's a minimum of 21 days consultation. Then you take the responses into account. You also have to notify the Secretary of State when you start the consultation. And then you have a decision as to whether you confirm the Article 4 direction on the basis of the representations you've received or do not proceed with it. So what we did was something called a non-immediate Article 4 direction, which is effectively rules out the potential for developers to challenge the Article 4 in terms of compensation. There's a sort of a period of grace that a local authority is given if it gives enough notification that it doesn't have to pay compensation to developers for any loss of permitted development rights. You can do an immediate one, but you're at risk of a developer, you essentially having to pay the developer's loss of profits or loss of their additional costs associated with going through the planning process.
Would you, as the Council, consider expanding the areas covered by the Article 4 exemptions to mitigate the impact on the expansion of the PDR schemes?
Well, we are now, so I'm taking a paper to Cabinet because of the London plan, essentially. Because we're a provide capacity borough, we cannot afford to lose. A lot of our business premises are in non-designated areas, about 40%. So we cannot achieve the London plan goal of increasing the amount of employment floor space within our borough if on the one hand a huge supply chain is being lost without the need for replacement, which is currently our planning policies. You cannot, unless you do permitted development, you would be required to show that the existing employment use is unviable, and then we might well accept a mixed use scheme, but we would seek to maximise the amount of replacement employment floor space provided in that development.
Thank you. And the final two questions I had for you, sir, was what are the drawbacks of the Article 4 exemptions, and is the process resource intensive for you as a borough?
It's not too resource intensive. The simpler the Article 4, the less resource resource intensive it is. So, I mean, there was the non-immediate element of it did, for those who are more savvy, result in some people submitting prior approvals just before the deadline. You know, there was a small increase, but not massive. So the impact has not been that significant in terms of adverse impact on resources. And subsequent, I mean, the Article 4s have dropped off actually quite significantly. I mean, since looking at it for this meeting. So prior to 2017, I think we had about 15 B1 to office. And in the last year before the Article 4 kicked in the rest of the borough, we've only had a couple now of office to residential Article 4. So it's probably an element of the lack of supply of office now is actually pushing up rents to such a degree, plus the cooling down of the housing market is making it more finely balanced between the two. And also, of course, if investors are aware of the price of the property and the Article 4 element is, the permitted development element is pushing up landowners' expectations, that's probably slowing down the extent to which sites come forward for development as well.
Thank you. And can I ask Jessica or Henry, how often are requests for Article 4 exemptions denied by the government, and what are the reasons for that?
I have no idea.
We don't have that information, unfortunately. I think the only thing we can really add on Article 4s is that some local authorities told us that it is quite cumbersome and that they don't have the resources available. There are issues because in some instances the office space that they value is quite dispersed, and the Article 4 directions aren't really a kind of feasible way of tackling that. And because they have to show how the council would meet housing requirements from elsewhere, that's something which is a challenge. So in practice, it's difficult.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Secretary of State has refused Article 4 directions, particularly blanket ones. So we were mindful of that when we would have liked to have done a whole borough Article 4 direction at that time, but we were mindful of the fact that the Secretary of State might well intervene, so we restricted it to the SIL and ELSIS. But now, because of the London Plan policy, we feel we have no alternative if we're to achieve that policy outcome to cover the rest of the borough with an Article 4 direction.
Doesn't it mean, Paul, that with the PD rights extension to light industry as well as office, that you're going to, because the Article 4 is going to be concentrated in one area, you get this point about, Henry's point about dispersed, you get much less of a mixed-use community.
True, yeah.
And I
which
think
comes back to what is the role of planning and
it's bad planning.
sustainability.
It goes back to, it doesn't make for good communities, does it? And it goes back to Henry's point about place.
It does have an impact, financial impact on local authorities. And if you combine that, in Camden they spent £30,000 or more just gathering evidence to support the Article 4, more £1,000 to send out the notification letters, £20,000 in officer time to put all this through, was their estimate. And on top of that, they're not getting the fees that are associated with planning applications. So there are resource implications, financial implications for local authorities in all of this. So if the answer at London level was, well, let's just encourage local authorities to put in Article 4s, then there are huge resourcing implications across the board, I think.
Thank you very much. And going back to Jack, on prior approval, is it feasible to attach a minimum space standard requirement to the prior approval process, do you think?
I think in principle it's a fine idea. I think in practice, I think it's worth speaking to developers or planners and planning consultants rather than me on that question. Just on the Article 4 directions, I think it's worth noting because so much of London, large parts of London are exempt because of Article 4 directions. Therefore, the impact of permitted development in London is blunted because of that. And I think it's just worth bearing that in mind throughout the hearing, if that makes I know it's an obvious thing, but...
Okay, thank you. And for Arshad, is the prior approval process significantly less burdensome for developers than a full planning permission in your view?
It is. I mean, permitted development is less burdensome, but I think where it is that it has resulted into office to resi because that's the kind of evidence out there. And from our view, it does come out that there are a number of issues with that, and that's kind of, I mean, if the policy is going to actually have negative consequences, then probably it's worth looking at them and then refining them. So our kind of proposals to the government are on this permitted development, that anything to do with airspace development, they have space standards, design standards, they have provision of affordable housing, and we pay the fees. But there is some certainty around in the process.
I think that I'm going to leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the committee?
You wanted me to ask one?
Oh yes, the mayor's role. I beg your pardon.
It's okay. Only if you want to say to ask.
Yes, please.
But, just before that, this is about what the mayor can do, if anything. I mean, he's already written very strongly saying what he feels in response to the consultation on the upward extensions and the demolition in terms of office for resi, for permitted development, under permitted development. But given that, given if it were to go through, is there anything that you think the mayor specifically could do to sort of mitigate it? I don't know who would want to respond to this. And also, allied to the last question, does the demolition and the upward extension apply to an area which has an Article 4 direction? Does anyone know?
Mr. Bhatti.
Sorry, I just want to, I assume that in principle the mayor's proposal is to go against it. It may not be the case. I just want to highlight that the research we did in 2016, at the end of 2016, there is potential to build 180,000 new homes through airspace development. 60,000 of those are above council and housing associate properties. If we put that into context that they should be design compliant, space standard compliant, affordable compliant, policy compliant, even at 50%. I mean, we're doing a program with GLA where we're committed to deliver 50% affordable. There are other, it fundamentally makes sure the building is safer than it is, and it looks better than it is. So
that's what you're suggesting?
Yeah, that's our suggestion. But something...
Well, then it might as well be under the planning system, mightn't it?
It would be. I'm not suggesting. What I'm saying is that when these things are taken care of, these are the main ills with PDR. With the current planning permission and with our experience, it is quite difficult to get through. So some kind of balance in terms of ensuring that we don't lose out the quality and the required outcome we want from these houses to be carbon neutral and some of other main issues, but if it gets into the planning permission, it's the same what is happening. It's quite a complex undertaking in terms of airspace development. The potential that there could be at least 60,000 affordable homes in London, we may lose too much by having a blanket opposition to that.
Just, I don't know, I'd like to hear some reactions. It just seems to me, if the prior approval system has to go through all those, then it's going to slow things down quite a lot, isn't it?
Oh, I completely agree. Once you start setting criteria, someone's got to assess them and make sure they're met and follow up, and before you know it, you're in a light touch planning system.
That's right, you might as well go through the planning system.
Yeah.
That's my point. Is there anyone else who's got anything they want to say about, if this were to go ahead, is there any action the mayor could take to mitigate it? I mean, he obviously is making the point about the damage to the economy and so on, the lack of quality and whatever. But, yes?
I'd like to see our mayor congratulate his predecessor on the efforts, the considerable efforts he made to improve the quality of London's housing. The London Housing Design Guide was brought in by Boris Johnson, and he championed space standards and famously promised the end of Hobbit homes. You'll all remember all of this.
Yes,
So-
I actually asked him
so-
what he wanted to be known for.
So he gets
Do you want him
it.
to know that?
He fought for it. It wasn't just something that, you know, he stood by and said, well, if you think this is the right thing, get on with it. As far as
Listen to his officers, that's the point.
Oh, okay. Well, you know much better than me. Anyway,
I do.
all of these standards came in under his watch, and he wrote the foreword to the London Housing Design Guide, and he's taken credit for it, and quite right. So, how could he be comfortable with the abandonment of all this hard work? Because one of the things he promised was that quality wouldn't suffer at the expense of quantity. It's in the foreword. I just don't understand how he would be comfortable with the situation we have now with misdevelopment, where there are no quality controls effectively, apart from the safeguards of building regulations, which of course are important, but they are just that. They are basically to keep you alive and out of danger. They're not qualitative as such on the whole.
I'm just trying to imagine the look on Sadiq Khan's face when the recommendation from
Yeah,
his planning
yeah, I'm
committee
sure.
is thank your predecessor.
But more constructively, maybe. I think we need a much better definition of a dwelling. I think we're calling small bedrooms with a shower in one corner a dwelling now. That's a bigger, longer term legal thing, but we desperately need that. Lots of this accommodation is being called temporary accommodation, but that's not how it was. That's not what it got approval for. That's all very floppy, I think, and is allowed to be floppy in London.
Is it being called temporary accommodation?
Yeah, Newbury House is definitely, Redbridge's answer was only temporary accommodation. I've never seen that on a prior approval application at all. If it would be polite to point out, or useful to point out, that these homes are probably not fit for human habitation. Because I think at some point that is going to come home to roost, and people will be looking for someone to blame. Who let homes of 8.3 square metres, is the latest in Purley, be built?
Well, my colleague's point, report, slums for the future.
So when there is a legal challenge, and I think it is a question of when, not if, there's going to be quite a lot of worthless assets in London and elsewhere. People who've bought might find themselves in negative equity, and an awful lot of landlords might be at best embarrassed and at worst stuck with homes they can't let because they haven't failed the test of fitness for human habitation. So I know that sounds very extreme, but I do think this is very extreme. And look, if I just flash this up at you, here's the smallest home that should be allowed under the space standard, and here's the flats in Newbury House, and that's not the smallest.
I think, anyway, you make a very nice point in terms of intergovernmental sphere diplomacy, to remind the Prime Minister and his cabinet that,
Yeah, start nicely.
I think
that he actually did bring in the space standards.
He's not known for inconsistency.
Are there any other points to be made? Because bearing in mind this has been a very interesting session where we've actually had disagreement. We're actually finishing off on a subject on which I think we have some agreement, which is that the space standards certainly do need to be attended to under permitted development. Perhaps we haven't agreed on anything else, but at least we have agreed on that. So,
maybe one other one is that the Secretary of State could undertake not to turn down a request for Article 4, because that is like the final insult to democracy. If they've put in the hard work, done all the notifications, decided they need to for good reason, and then he says no.
It's called localism.
That's a good one too. You've actually, between you, and Jack too contributed, made more points than just in terms of quality than just space standards.
yes, no, I was saying that there are
Absolutely, space is a good start, but it's by no
Yes,
means
but there are other
panacea.
quality issues.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
I mean, you could
Not just in an ideal world.
You could get the Mayor to push for exemptions, and that was one of the elements of the original office to residential. Certain parts of London in particular, the CAS, etc., were exempt. They've now had to change because the the permitted development rights have been made permanent, but there was a process initially where every local authority could ask for exemption from the permitted development right. London was successful, central London.
Yeah.
Tunbridge Wells was successful, where I worked, which had much more office and etc. Wasn't successful, so it was a bit random how it was given out, but that would certainly save the need for Article 4 directions to be brought in.
That's right. I see would say the need. 28 boroughs asked for exemptions.
I've got 30 from a London Council's briefing, and only 11 were granted out of the 30.
That's right. And they were the ones
I think we're going back on information.
Yeah,
Okay.
we've
But
gone over.
one more point where we did
It's
all
something
agree
unique,
was
something
daylight.
different. Sorry.
We did all agree that daylight was quite necessary too.
The Mayor needs to make representations on.
Well, I mean, you mentioned space standards, but I think space and daylight.
I mean, it's
I think
worth
with circulation. What about
I'm desperately.
ventilation?
It's a very long history,
I'm
but-
so pleased you want to stay longer than.
I do.
but Dr. Ferm.
Henry has left, but I know because we've been working with the TCPA that they have been collecting some very powerful evidence around the impact on mental health of living in some of the homes that we're talking about in terms of lack of access to daylight, living in rooms, habitable rooms without windows, which I think could if we mobilised a campaign around healthy homes, which the TCPA is doing, I think that could be quite powerful at the national level.
And dare I give the last word to Mr. Airey? I'm going to see if
I was just going to make the point on daylight sunlight rules that many of the most loved homes in London, like mansion blocks, would be illegal now to build because of daylight sunlight rules.
I'm not going to let anybody challenge that. Thank you. I'm delighted with the contributions that you've made today. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate the whole committee appreciates the time you've given to us and the very challenging contributions that we've made. So you're free to go. We've got a few more formal items on the agenda to get through, so we're going to be staying for a few more minutes. You're welcome to see that if you're mad, but otherwise you can go. Please do go through. Thank you. Finally, can I also ask the committee to note the report and the discussion and agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair to agree any output from the discussion. Agreed. Item 7, can I ask the committee to note the work programme report? And can I also ask the committee to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair to agree the planning committee's draft London plan examination in public report listing the Assembly's proposals for policy changes? The date of item 10, the date of the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 13th of November at 2 p.m. in Committee Room 5 City Hall. Is that noted? And if there is any urgent other items, and therefore I will bring this meeting to a close. Thank you very much.
GLA, Committee Room 5, sound. GLA, Committee Room 5.